Thank you. And really, I'm really sorry for the delay, everyone, but we are here. So it's my privilege today to invite Dr. Jeffrey Nicolaisen, who is currently based at the University or the National Yangming Jiao Tong University in Taiwan. Am I right? Are you in Taiwan at the moment?
Yes, that's where I am, correct.
Okay. So Jeffrey's work, he earned his PhD in religious studies at Duke University in the United States, and his current research uses Taiwanese traditions and teachings to rethink networks of humans and non-human agencies, and also the ethics of multi-species interactions between the Hans and the indigenous people. And also, I'm sure your talk will talk about dogs, monkeys, and other animals in Taiwan today. So if you're ready, the floor is yours. Really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta, for the introduction and for the invitation today. I'm glad to have this platform today to kind of reach an international audience, something that I guess we can now do with platforms like Zoom, but I think that Sci-Tech Asia has kind of a special platform in the sense that it is so international. And so I think I'll start by sharing my presentation here. Okay. Does everyone see that?
Yes, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll just jump in. Today, the title of my talk is The Buddhist Encounter with Liberal Humanism and Diane Hunters in Contemporary Taiwan. So this research is based on fieldwork that I did from the summer 2015 to the spring of 2018. I've been back in Taiwan since 2021, but with pandemic conditions and everything, it's been difficult to do field work, but I'm trying to pick that up again now. So this is part of a multi-species or multi-sided ethnography focused on Life Conservationist Association, Guanhai Shengming Xiehui, which is headquartered in Taipei. But I also work with an indigenous community in Tianpu Bulo, in Jianshu Xiang, Hsinchu. I've done some international work beyond Taiwan to see how this movement from Taiwan has affected the animal protection movement in Japan and China as well. But in particular, I'm going to focus on the Taiwan context today. And the basic objectives for today's presentation are an ontological analysis, a kind of comparison of the boundary conditions between several different ontologies. So I intend to put teachings such as Buddhism, Christianity, liberalism, and Diane Gaga on equal terms. And basically to do that, I'm going to talk about two different case studies. One from a kind of objection of a Buddhist practice by a Diane community, and the other an objection of Diane practices from the Buddhist community. So the first is to examine the release of life as a Buddhist practice facing objections from the Diane people, and then examine hunting as a Diane practice facing objections by Buddhist-inspired animal protectionists. Using both of these case studies, what I hope to do is demonstrate how liberal values such as the freedom of religion and indigenous rights mediate human conflict over non-human animals. And then kind of conceptually, I want to consider equality of life as an alternative to human equality or liberalism and human rights. So the outline for today's talk, I'm going to start with a comparison of human equality and equality of life, move on to the concept of animals in Gaga, the law of the Dian people, and then go on to the conflict over the release of hunting and the conflict over, or the release of life and the conflict over hunting, before reaching the conclusion. So my question for today is, what is equality? And I'll start with the human equality that underlies much of international law now. I understand that since the time of John Locke, there's been a lot of change to our conceptions of human equality. But when we look at the legal structure, we can oftentimes draw a straight line to John Locke. So I'm going to start by talking about human equality through John Locke. And then I'm going to move on to equality of life, which has a long history in Buddhism, but in Taiwan today, one of the strongest promoters of equality of life is Chiao. So I'll talk about how she is thinking about equality of life. So first, let me talk briefly about John Locke. I'm more of an Asia scholar than an Enlightenment Europe scholar. So I think about John Locke through secondary scholarship, and particularly Jeremy Waldron, who's written about the justification of human equality. And he says that we rarely ask now, what is the justification of human equality? But if we do, he suggests that Locke still makes the best case for human equality. And Locke's argument is actually indistinguishable from Christianity. So Locke's basic argument is that God bestowed rationality on humans so that humans can know him. And once humans know that there is a God, then they know that there's someone to hold them account after they die. So that's the basis for all virtue. And according to Locke, atheists cannot truly be virtuous because they know no God. They haven't used their rationality to deduce there is a God. So even though there's equality because of rationality, there's kind of two levels here, one for people that have deduced there's a God and atheists who have not yet done so. But we can see the Christian roots of his justification for human equality. And so now I'll talk briefly about Chiao and introduce her a little bit. She's a Taiwanese Buddhist nun. She co-founded the Buddhist Hongshu College, and the capacity in which I'll talk about her today is as co-founder of Life Conservationist Association, Guanhuai Shengming Xiehui. And this is an animal protection organization or conservation organization in Taiwan. Currently, she spends most of her time as a professor of religion and culture at Shenzhen University. So she addresses Christian theories of equality very directly in her book, Buddhist Normative Ethics. And she says, compared to Christianity's theory that God, humans, and animals have different statuses, the Buddhist theory of equality among sentient beings provides a strong theoretical foundation for treating humans and animals with equal kindness. So she actually argues that in Buddhism, there's three levels of equality. The first form or level of equality is 众生平等, equality of sentient beings. And this is a very simple form of equality because sentient beings are equal because they all have the capacity of sentience. So I think that's fairly straightforward. The second level of equality is the quality of the nature of all dharmas. This maybe is a little harder to grasp for non-Buddhists, but a dharma is basically all things. And this type of equality is based on the fact that all things arise from causes and conditions. Because the universe is causal, all things arise from causes, and because they all arise based on causes, they're equal in that regard. So that one may not even be limited to just sentient beings, but all existence. The third form of equality is the equality of Buddha nature. For many Buddhists, or for most Buddhists, all sentient beings have the capacity to become a Buddha. It may be in a future life. In fact, for almost all beings, it is in a future life. But at some point in the future, they have the capacity to become a Buddha, and for that reason, all sentient beings are equal. And we can see here that just as John Locke's form of equality is based on Christianity, Shi Jiahui's form of equality is very clearly based on a Buddhist cosmology. So now I'd like to talk about animals in Gaga. And before I introduce Gaga, I want to first introduce my field site in Jianshi County, Tianpu Buluo. This community is in the mountains at an elevation of 1,000 to 1,200 meters. It's a small hamlet with around 145 households, officially 446 residents, which you'll see on the weekends, but on the weekdays, many of these residents are down in the lowlands working or going to school. Very significantly is that until 1978, there was no road that went into Tianpu Buluo. So to reach the nearest market, it was about a 10-hour walk to Neiwan. And so on a day-to-day basis, people in this community had to rely completely on agriculture, hunting, and gathering for subsistence and survival. Now it's more of an agricultural community. As I mentioned, many people work in the lowlands, but people that stay in the hamlet during the weekday are primary farmers growing tomatoes and other crops. Also very significant is that most people, like most indigenous people in Taiwan, there's a strong influence of Christianity in this hamlet. So I asked one local person, and he estimated that 80% of the community is Christian. And I said, well, what about the other 20%? Well, he said they're Catholic. So pretty much everyone is Christian in some way or another. And that all really started following World War II. As I'll talk in a second, basically with the Japanese occupation of the central Taiwan region, the indigenous people had to change very rapidly. And to adapt to that, after World War II, many adopted Christianity as missionaries were allowed by the Taiwanese government to come into the mountain regions, even while they didn't allow Han people into these mountain regions. So the government was afraid that if Han people, Taoists and Buddhists went into the mountains, that they would organize a rebellion against the government. So they didn't allow Han people to go, but because they wanted to court support from the United States and other European countries, they allowed Christian missionaries to go into the mountains. And these people brought food and medical supplies, and many of the indigenous people converted. I would say at this level, it was very kind of a superficial conversion to accept these gifts that these missionaries were bringing. After the missionaries left, the churches were falling in disrepair. People were not donating what they had previously donated, and things were kind of just falling apart. But in 1972, there was a Bible group of women that got together to study the Bible, and a number of women, especially one woman named Siwas, started to be possessed by evil spirits and also the Holy Spirit. And they would make accusations to their community. They would roll around on the ground. They would speak in tongues, kind of a classic kind of Pentecostal charismatic revival movement. And this really persuaded the local people to believe sincerely and naturalized Christianity. Not only in Tianpu, but Tianpu people carried these prophets from village to village, and they spread this new revival movement. And although now this belief in Christianity is sincere and genuine, but it also has another purpose, because before Christianity, indigenous people had long-lasting kind of feuds with local bands and local nations. And so as they were colonized by Japanese and then later Han people, to come together as indigenous communities with a new identity, they needed something to bring them together. And Christianity kind of serves that purpose of making a universal identity for Taiwan's indigenous people in opposition to Taiwan's Han people. So now let me explain a little bit about Gaga. Gaga it actually means law in the Dayan language. And this form of law was based on the practice of headhunting, hunting humans until around 1930. The Japanese had a campaign to conquer the indigenous people, which had remained completely independent and free. They were never conquered by any other colonizers before the Japanese, not the Qing dynasty, not the Spanish, not the Dutch, who had all tried to colonize Taiwan. But the Japanese, using modern warfare practices, succeeded in colonizing the indigenous people. And by 1930, they were using headhunting as a way to pit enemy indigenous people against enemy tribes. And at this point, not only did Japan try to outlaw headhunting, but trying to use it to pit them against each other made what was originally an honorable practice a shameful practice. And so it disappeared very quickly. And what happened at this point is that the practice, the rituals that were previously involved in headhunting were converted to rituals for hunting of non-human animals. And the way this works is that the ancestors are always watching their progeny. Even though they're in the other hunting ground, they're always watching. And when a hunter obeys the laws of Gaga, they will reward the hunter with a successful hunt. And obeying the laws of Gaga means obeying seasonal restrictions on hunting, rules about hunting to excess, moral behavior, and the rituals involved in Gaga could also be used to settle disputes by hunting. There were all kinds of different purposes for this. But now let's look at how animals are perceived in Gaga. Before going to the mountains, in my field research, I read some of the literature on the Dayan people. And according to this literature, when Dayan hunters die, just as Dayan women who have received tattoos because they've mastered the art of weaving, when these tattooed hunters and women die, they go to the other hunting ground by crossing the rainbow. And according to the literature, the Dayan hunter brings all of the game that he hunted in his lifetime with him to the other side of the rainbow. So in this, you can see that there could be some sense of equality among beings because all beings go to the afterlife, to the other hunting ground to continue life there after death. When I did my field work, I talked to a Dayan scholar who's Dayan himself, but also a professor of anthropology. and works by studying the Dayan people. And I said, if I really want to understand Gaga, who should I talk to? And he gave me the names of some elders. And I went to talk to these elders, and they were involved in the church. One was a Christian pastor, a Protestant pastor. The other asked to meet in the church. And when I asked them about animals and their relationships and how Gaga views animals, they said, no, a hunter does cross the Rainbow Bridge, but he doesn't bring any animals across with him. The animals don't go to the other hunting ground. And they said, no, animals, they're not animated, they don't have souls, they don't have spirits. So this was very different from what I saw in the literature. And I'm not sure how to understand it. It could be that there's geographical differences. It could be that things have changed with history, or it could be very possibly the influence of Christianity as well. But then I took a look at some of the official materials. In Taiwan now, the government is supporting revival of indigenous languages and indigenous cultures. In fact, this is basically the top priority of the Council of Indigenous People. So many nations of indigenous people are receiving funding and support to create these types of associations that support the language and culture. For Dayan people, there is the Dayan Language and Culture Research and Development Association, who issues books, educational materials, films. And when I read these materials, it looked very close to the literature I had read. There seemed to be a sort of animism, a sort of respect for animals. And this was most clearly communicated in the film Rainbow's Judgment. And in this film, a boy has a dream that he meets the great ancestor of the Dayan people, who's named Buddha. And Buddha has just hunted a wild boar. And he teaches to this young boy that all life is equal. And so when you hunt an animal, you have to thank it for giving up its life for you. And so this was really intriguing to see the use of the idea of equality of life in the materials put out by the Dayan Language, Culture, and Research Development Association. So there may be a difference between people in Zhenshi and the elites who are promoting Dayan culture and even producing materials to teach to the Dayan youth. So let me move on to the conflict over the release of life. When I originally went to the Zhenshi Township, I was interested in human-animal relationships and particularly hunting. But when I arrived there, I encountered something which I call multi-species colonization, because many of the hunters and farmers were telling me about dogs and monkeys the size of chimpanzees, or chimpanzees and poisonous snakes that were all released by Buddhists that were coming into the mountains and just releasing animals there. And then the indigenous people would have to deal with all these animals who are more dangerous because they're used to humans and need to be taken care of because there's no one else to take care of them except the indigenous people in the mountains. As I learned about these stories, there actually appeared a very particular story about how this was happening. Basically, a 10-minute drive from Tiempu is another band of the Dayan people called Yulao. Yulao is at kind of a waypoint on the way from the front mountain region to the back mountain region. Many tourists are going to famous tourist destinations such as Sumakusu or Jinshibao, stop at Yulao on the way there There's a restaurant there. There's this scenic outlook that I have in the picture here. So this is a very busy place during the day with many tourists and buses coming along. And as the story goes, people from Taiwan's largest Buddhist organization, Siji, would drive up to Yulao, get out of their cars, release all kinds of animals like monkeys and poisonous snakes, get back in their car and drive off. And they did this several days in a row. Well, this sounded like something that many people may have witnessed, and perhaps there was some form of record. But first, we followed up with the informants about this and asked them, well, how did you know that these people were from Siji? And they said, well, we're not really sure. We didn't see this ourselves. We've just heard these kind of stories. And so we contacted the police station in Yulao, and the chief of police, who I believe is Diane and lives in a community, he's also heard these rumors. He had no official reports, but when he's heard the rumors, he's kind of followed up, and he had the same experience that we did. He couldn't identify any eyewitnesses. So I looked into Suji's doctrine, and in general, they're against the practice of fangsheng, or release of life, not because it's fundamentally wrong, but because the way that it's done presently often involves introducing animals to ecosystems to which they're not adapted, or harming the animals in the process of transport or capture. So Siji and its founder Zhongyan are generally unsupportive of the practice. But if you look a little bit further into the literature or the media in Taiwan, you will actually find that there are a number of reports of Buddhist organizations releasing poisonous snakes. In particular, there's one organization that is involved in most of these reports, and that's Zhonghua Husheng Xiehui, or Chinese Life Protection Association. This association was founded by a monk named Shi Haitao, and in 2009, he actually admits to releasing poisonous snakes, and he defends his followers for releasing cobras in that year in Miaoli. And then in 2012, Haitao's followers admitted on Facebook to releasing 70 kilograms of poisonous snakes. And they said they were led by a leader who's done this multiple times and purchased these snakes from some sort of market that seems to exist in Taiwan for the express purpose of the release of life. Haitao teaches that cobras who have heard the recitation of the sutras as part of the release of life ceremony will not bite people. But the local people where these cobras are released generally do not share Haitao's belief. So then I ask, well, what is the law regulating the release of life in Taiwan? And although there are some minor regulations, there is no official law passed by the legislative yuan. And the reason for that is because although there's recognition in society that this practice can be harmful by introducing invasive species or harmful to animals for capturing and re-releasing species, it's a religious ritual, so it's protected by the freedom of religion. Any law that passed would be preceded by the right to the freedom of religion. So the government is currently in negotiation with religious organizations, but is still hesitant to pass laws regulating the practice. So what does Shi Jiahui think about the release of life? As a religious leader and a Buddhist, you may think she supports the practice and supports the freedom of religion. But on the contrary, she says, For a long time, religion has been comparable to animal protection laws, area outside of the sphere of civilization. Animal protection law in Taiwan has been comparable to the one country, two systems policy. Releasing birds and land animals and releasing aquatic animals is comparable to a giant heap of merchandise. Long ago, the Buddhist sentiment of sympathizing with all life was twisted and distorted by a utilitarian mindset. So Chiao Hui is not completely against the release of life ceremony. She's against the way that it's practiced and how it harms animals. And she speaks very strongly against the protection of the freedom of religion because she sees the protection of animals as primary over the protection of religious freedoms. So now I'll briefly talk about the case of indigenous hunting, and Diane hunting in particular. The Diane people, like many indigenous people in Taiwan, prefer to hunt 4 species: the wild boar, the Reeves muntjac, the Formosan serow, and the Formosan sambar deer. Until 2019, of these 4, only wild boar were classified as general wildlife. The other 3 were protected wildlife, which could not legally be hunted. But because this was a long tradition for indigenous people to hunt all of these animals and other animals, the wildlife conservation law criminalized traditional indigenous behaviors and practices. So how did this hunting law come about? Basically, early prohibitions on hunting were modeled on American law and were very ineffective. So by 1972, many species were endangered or decreasing in number. And as an emergency measure, the government decided to issue a 3-year moratorium on hunting in 1972. As you'll recall, in Tiempu, until 1978, there was no road built into the community. So the community had to rely on hunting, gathering, and agriculture to survive. So this law was, it criminalized an indigenous practice that couldn't end because it was really the basis for survival. The national park law also forbid hunting on national parks. And in 1989, the government, under international pressure, passed the first conservation law, the Wildlife Conservation Act. They modeled this act on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife and Fauna, also known as CITES. This convention and this act, based on the convention, adopted scientific naturalism and treated non-human animals as resources or commodities. It banned hunting of protected species and gave no exceptions for indigenous peoples. But 1989 and the years following were a time of democratization in Taiwan following the 1987 dissolution of martial law. Activist groups were forming, nonprofit groups were forming, Buddhist groups were proliferating, and at that time, Shi Jiahui and her followers also formed an organization called Guanhuai Shengming Xiehui, the Life Conservationist Association, which they established in 1993. Immediately after following LCA, they organized the Eco-Conservation Alliance. And with the ECA, they drafted an amendment which passed the legislature in 1994. Now, this amendment completely rewrote the wildlife conservation law. It retained the CITES structure, but it had one primary objective, and that's to eliminate the profit motive from wildlife management. So they had 2 goals. to control the trade of wildlife and products made from wildlife, and second, to prohibit domestic breeding of wild animals. They actually did, in rewriting the conservation law, make an exception for indigenous people to hunt, but only in very narrowly defined traditional ceremonies. And they also prohibited traps and snares, which are commonly used by indigenous people down to the present day. So at the same time that Life Conservationist Association became the first major animal protection organization in Taiwan, the indigenous people also had their own movement that really started in the 1980s, but gained recognition in the United Nations in 1991, when Taiwan's indigenous peoples, NGOs, gained recognition even when Taiwan didn't have recognition in the United Nations itself. So, aligning with the global indigenous movement, the United Nations was successful in 2007 in passing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which defended the right to hunt, the right to gather, the right to use resources, etc., along with some previous laws, including those that I list here. I won't go into detail on those due to time, but just to note that that was not the first law that protected these rights. In Taiwan, on the other hand, the major act protecting indigenous people's rights was passed in 2005. It's called the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law. This law was based on negotiations that were going on at the United Nations at the time to create the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which wasn't passed until 2 years later. But Taiwan, unable to participate in the United Nations, got ahead of the United Nations and passed the same principles into their law in 2005. Article 19 of this law protects hunting along with gathering and the use of other resources such as water resources, as long as the activities are conducted for traditional culture, ritual, or self-consumption. Problem is that when the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law was passed, it didn't nullify the Wildlife Conservation Act. So there was a conflict between these two laws. And to work out this conflict, some cases needed to run through the courts. Indigenous hunters were also prosecuted under the Controlling Guns, Ammunition, and Knives Act. So that also produced conflicts with the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law. But judges generally favored the Wildlife Conservation Act. So it needed a test case to go to the Constitutional Court. And this test case started in 2013 when Damadalum, a Bunan hunter, captured a Reeves muntjac and a Formosan serow, which he shot for his ailing mother, to feed his ailing mother. He was caught and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison and fined 70,000 Taiwanese dollars, which is approximately equal to 2,200 USD. The sentence was suspended in 2017 when Damadalum and his lawyer challenged the sentence, and it was referred to the Constitutional Court for their interpretation. On May 7, 2021, the Constitutional Court issued a mixed ruling. They upheld the sentence against Damadalum, and they said that indeed the Wildlife Conservation Act has priority over the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law because the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law is a basic law. It basically is a list of principles. But the Wildlife Conservation Act is a specific law with specific regulations, and this form of law takes precedence. Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, who had previously apologized to the indigenous people for years of colonial practices, had sympathy for Dharma Delum and announced a pardon on May 20th, 2021, which resolved Dharma Delum's case, but it left the conflict between these laws unresolved. So I then asked, what does Chiao have to say about this anti-hunting campaign? And she says, just by returning to the basic aspect of humaneness, the anti-hunting campaigners could instead oppose blood sacrifice and meat eating. Then couldn't the pure and honest indigenous people become our comrades? However, in terms of campaign strategy, that would cause us to make enemies with a greater population than the indigenous people, meat-eating consumers, and the followers of popular religions, causing anti-blood sacrifice and anti-meat-eating campaigns to fail alongside the anti-hunting campaign. So in this concept, we can see a sort of Buddhist colonialism that Buddhists, as influential in the Han community, are part of the majority culture, and it's easier to wage a campaign against the indigenous minority from a strategic perspective. On the other hand, it's very clear that Zhao Hui argues that, yes, we have sympathy for the indigenous people, but we also have sympathy for non-human animals who are also a disadvantaged minority. So we want to protect them first, and we can promote indigenous people to develop so that they don't have to hunt. And of course, in the indigenous community, there's a diverse range of opinions about these movements, but I don't have time to talk about all of the opinions. I'm just going to quote here one of the elders that I talked to in Jianshi Township. And he says, so according to the state's conservation, if a Chinese moccasin enters your house, you can't kill it. You can't kill a poisonous snake. If it is in our house, we will definitely kill it. We protect people. We don't protect snakes. We protect animals, not those threatened and endangered species. So you can see here a type of equivocation. Dali is equivocating back and forth between probably at least three ontologies: the ontology of Gaga, the ontologies of the Buddhists, the ontologies of the conservationists, and comparing, saying, yes, we protect animals, but we don't protect snakes. We protect our people first. We don't protect threatened and endangered species first. So there's a lot of interesting analysis that could be done there, and I do that in my writing, but I don't have time to go into detail on that today. So I'll move to my conclusions. Recently, I've been working on the constitutional amendment. My original fieldwork ended around 2018, and although I came back to Taiwan in 2021, it's been hard to get back into fieldwork with the pandemic and other conditions going on. But in 2020, more than 100 NGOs formed the Animal Protection Legislative Movement Coalition, the APLMC. And they made 8 proposals for legislative changes. Among those 8, the most bold was a proposal to put animal protection in the Constitution. And after making this proposal, 8 legislators followed by making separate proposals with kind of different language to create constitutional amendments. And these legislators represent the 2 largest parties in Taiwan and a third party, which is also one of the largest, but not the 2 key parties that generally battle for control of the government. And even the Council of Indigenous People finds no conflict with the movement for putting animal protection in the Constitution. Many Indigenous activists think that their traditional practices are based on animal protection, so they have no objection to this. But what I want to focus on today is how animal protection can be viewed completely different from different systems, different ontologies, in particular different forms of equality. From the perspective of human equality, we have the human right to religious freedom, which protects the release of life ceremony. And we have the human rights called indigenous rights, which protects indigenous hunting. Using human quality as the basis to evaluate ecological policy, the interests of non-human animals are not considered directly. Buddhists and Dayan both must frame ecological arguments in terms of liberalism. On the other hand, if we use equality of life, what's interesting to note is that when we talk about Buddhism or Buddha Dharma, in India, the teachings of Buddhism are considered a type of Dharma, a type of law. Dharma means law. And in Dayan's teachings, called Gaga, Gaga also means law. So we can say that in the Buddhist law, the equality of life is characterized by a prohibition on killing. And in Dayan's Gaga, if there is an equality of life, as some elites have asserted, this equality of life is characterized by hunting. Of course, this type of equality of life of the Dayan is not universally agreed, and local Taiwanese Dayan people in Jinshu feel the rights of indigenous people are curtailed by conservation law and don't recognize equality of life. But Dayan elites promote equality of life in the practice of hunting as part of a public version of Gaga. So using equality of life, the interests of non-humans are directly considered. So in conclusion, I have basically three ideas here. First, both sides must not only comprehend the ontology of their opponent, they must also comprehend and operate in the dominant system of liberalism, effectively a third ontology. Second, Buddhism's equality of life struggles for recognition in a domain governed by human equality. So while Buddhists may campaign on equality of life and are campaigning to put it in the Constitution, human equality and human rights already are in the Constitution and regulate what laws can be passed. And third, the equality of life introduces a type of Buddhism-inspired colonialism at the same time that it provides a boundary-crossing language of animal protection with indigenous people. So I think it's already close to 7 o'clock, or in my time here in Taiwan. I guess I know we're all in different time zones. So I think I better stop here. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I really enjoy it. And I think especially at the end, you've mentioned a number of points that I think is very thought-provoking. I already see one. Yes, that's an endorsement in the chat. Right. So I would like to open the floor for Q&A, and usually people will take a few minutes to gather their thought. So maybe you and I can start the conversations now before people use the. So if you have a questions, please use the raise hand function or to type your questions in the chat, and I'll appreciate it if you first introduce yourself so our speaker knows who you are. So Jeffrey, thank you so much. I think it's super interesting. And I think the way you structure your talk is also very clear. And I especially like you. Okay, let me try to gather my thoughts. So I think your argument is very convincing and it's cogent. I hear what you're saying. So you're trying to look at the concept of equality from different ecologies, different systems, and using Taiwan as a case. And I really like that. But I guess as an anthropologist, I think the philosophical part, like why people do what they do and the philosophy behind it, you present it very well. But from an anthropological perspective, people when they actually act and when they do things, they are not 100% being guided by these philosophy, and especially I think Chinese and Taiwanese, they can be very pragmatic. So I wonder if you can maybe give us a few cases or scenarios where people they were influenced by these philosophies depending on which groups they belonged, but at the same time they've also make decision and judgment in the real life scenarios that's based on pragmatic decisions. Do you have those moments coming in when you were doing field work?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that
maybe I can give you an
communities,
example that reminds me what I've seen. So, for example, the release of life, and I hear that what you were saying, the Buddhist, like the Chiao way, she was against it, and then there was another organization, the 关怀生命社会, they were the one that kind of said it's okay, right? But for the people who were actually practicing the release of life, there were other pushes behind the motivations, right? Maybe it was for the health of a family, things like that. So what I'm saying is, although you make a very convincing case why people do what they do and the philosophy behind it, but when people who are actually like, I don't know, releasing the fish, there are usually more pragmatic reasons for people to do it rather than just these like principles. You see what I'm saying?
yes. So I think it's a very complicated question because there's many communities in what I'm talking about here, and so I do kind of condense things down into general principles, and so and I had multiple case studies here too. So there's the hunters on the ground, and then there's people releasing life on the ground. And, these issues are very complicated. So for example, the local people are in Jianshu are talking about Siji, and this actually comes from local people in Jianshu. It's not something that you read in the media or anything like that. So these are reports of local informants. And in this case, when they talk about Siji, I think that Siji is, as the largest kind of organization, it's kind of the face of Buddhism. So I think what this kind of represents when people talk about it is kind of the relationship that indigenous people have with Buddhism. And actually, the people that are doing release of life are not even Buddhists. Just like I'm not sure that these people that are releasing life, that are releasing animals in Jianshu are from Siji. They may not even be Buddhist because on the ground, like you say, people release life for many different reasons. And even according to some scholars, Taoists were the first to release life in China, even before Buddhists, and then later became a Buddhist practice and is known now as a Buddhist practice. But these religious groups that are releasing life in Taiwan, if you look at the major organizations, Buddhist organizations like Siji, Foguangshan, and Fagushan, they generally are opposed to the release of life. So these people releasing life are generally with smaller organizations, which can be characterized as folk religions, Taoist or mixed religions. They maybe have official religious organizations, but they combine Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And so they're not really well defined. And many of the people engaging in this practice don't do it in a strictly Buddhist way. So, you know, you may go and release fish, and some people kind of get addicted to it, the practice itself, or releasing snakes. And so there is a lot of variation in the practice. And in my initial research, I wasn't really researching the release of life. It's something that came up later, and so that's something I'm looking at now, and I intend to you know, do more on-the-ground research in that area. I was more interested in this case on how my interlocutors and informants in the indigenous communities were describing the practice, because I was interested in their relationship with animals and also their relationship with people outside of their community. And Siji becomes kind of a representative for Han communities. But I mean, if you ask for specific examples, I mean, in the animal protection community, this is a major issue because people will take dogs and keep them for a brief period of time, realize that they're more work than they thought, but because they feel like euthanizing the dog would be a violation of something, whether they're Buddhist or not, like there's just this kind of general cultural idea, Taoist or Buddhist or Han in general, that euthanizing a dog is going to bring you some kind of bad karma or gan-ing or something like that. So people will take the dogs into the mountains, and it may not even be a Buddhist ritual. And so many animal protectionists are trying to do more education just to let people know how much work it is to take care of a dog before they ever adopt it. So there's all kinds of things going on in this regard, and it's hard to describe it all in one presentation. I could go into the hunting practices too, and there's a lot of different opinions. They're not all represented by what I said today, but I probably should open up to some other questions too.
Yes,
mean, is that a sufficient answer?
Of course, yes. I think it's great that you say you're actually looking at how people describe it rather than the actual practice, and I think that's valid. So I think the next question is from Cohen. I hope I pronounced your name right, Cohen.
Hi, thank you. Nice to hear from you, Jeff, and really a great presentation of your research. I mean, it's really extremely stimulating to hear you're making the case. And I am for sure really inspired because I have done field work, as you know, in also indigenous region of Taiwan among the Zhou people, and hunting was also very much on the agenda. So I was really interested in hearing you make a very convincing argument of placing your community, your Dayan community in a larger Taiwanese context and involving Buddhists and involving authorities, and so a kind of a half macro context. Also, I was wondering, how does this function at the internal level at the community you were living? You say there are 80% Presbyterians, 20% Catholics. Apparently no other religious organizations. Buddhists, I don't think maybe there don't exist any Dayan Buddhists. Within the community, what are the power structures that might guide the discussion? Is there, I mean, are they the people you talk to, you seem to suggest that there are some discussions going on relating to what could be hunted, or if hunting at all should be continued, or what as part of being Dayan. Are there is it following religious lines, clan lines? Are there people who have got an education or not an education? Have you been able to be part of some of these internal discussions within the Dayan community on how they should relate to the conflicts you mentioned?
Well, thank you for this fantastic question, Kun, and it's great to see you here today too. This is another very broad question, which I have a lot to think about. First of all, I don't want to convey the idea that there's a discussion of ending the practice of hunting. I mean, Dayan people want to continue hunting, and so there's no idea of talking about the end of hunting. I think the bigger issue is how to kind of bring Gaga, the traditional belief system, together with Christianity. And first of all, I should say that everyone that I've met in Tiempu is Christian. In fact, when I go to the community, and generally when I go to indigenous communities, whether Dayan or Rukai or any other communities, the way that I learned to do it is to go to the church. I worked with Lin Yiren, and churches have become kind of the central community center of many of the buluo. So if you want to get engaged with the social structure, the first place to go is the church. And so in the church, and I've been to various ceremonies in the church and talked to the pastors, and there's a kind of complicated discussion going on, because the official line of the pastors is that there is no conflict between Gaga and Christianity. Essentially, Gaga and Christianity are the same teaching. This is kind of like the natural law concept, actually, that John Locke adheres to as well. Yes, Christians received the law in its purest form, but God spread the law around to all communities of the world. So it may not be called Christianity, but it's actually some kind of form of God's teachings. And so this is convincing to most people, and most Dayan or Sidic or other indigenous people I talk to will say, yes, Gaga or Gaia or these different teachings are the same as Christianity. But the problem is that there are actual conflicts between these laws. So ceremonies to worship the ancestors, I mean, you will not say worship now. I mean, it's called respecting the ancestors, right? And some people, when they go and hunt, there's this idea that you thank not the animals, but you thank the ancestors, because they're the ones that rewarded your behavior with animals. But some people now are thanking God instead of the ancestors. And this is at a very personal level of, are you thanking God or are you thanking the ancestors? And this kind of difference actually can kind of blow up in some ways. I mean, on the superficial level, people say these teachings are the same, but the pastors themselves know that there's some conflicts that have to be resolved, and the pastors from different hamlets are in discussion about how to resolve these things. Let me just give an example, which is not about hunting, but I think it bears out how there's a conflict between these different ceremonies. A lot of the practices of Gaga have been lost in the last 30 to 40 years or even longer, because there's been a lot of pressure not to speak the Dian language, that you can only speak Mandarin Chinese, that you have to follow Mandarin Chinese, you have to get an education in the public education system. And only recently has the government begun to promote revitalizing indigenous practices. So one way that Tiempu is trying to do this is to revitalize the practice of growing millet or xiaomi. And so there's a movement which also, interestingly enough, has a kind of Christian overtone to it, because they call it the Millet Ark Project. And so I was there with the Millet Ark Project, and we would sort through the millet. Some types of millet can grow at different elevations, and so we needed to find a millet that's the right form of millet for this elevation. And who we need to help us with that is the elder women, because they were responsible for planting the xiaomi. And so we have this elder woman from the community who helps us to sort the seed, and then we go out the next day to plant the seed. And at this point, there's a ceremony, and you have to take some food, and we had some food, you bury it, and you dedicate it to the ancestors. And in this ceremony, I needed a translator because I speak Mandarin, but I don't speak Dian. And one of my key contacts in the community was there, and she was translating for me. But when she heard what this elder said, she got so angry that she didn't want to translate what she said, because she wouldn't do the ceremony in the traditional Gaga way. She was afraid that it would violate the Christian principles to kind of dedicate the food to the ancestors. And this was disturbing to my informant who was translating, because of the idea that Gaga and Christianity are supposed to be the same. And so I think what's happening in the communities in this revitalization project is that traditions have to be created anew. I mean, you cannot go back to headhunting, which was the original center of Gaga, and hunting of non-human animals replaced that. But that practice has also been distorted too, because in the community, there's some people that follow Gaga. They hunt on the plots of land that are designated to them by the community, and they're supposed to only hunt in that area, because other areas of land are designated as a kind of non-hunting zone where animals can reproduce. And if you hunt kind of willy-nilly in all kinds of places, then where are the animals going to reproduce? But if you talk to some people that I talked to, one hunter told me, I hunt anytime, any place. Doesn't matter where. So he doesn't care about Gaga. And there's some hunters that are moving in that direction. And if you talk to indigenous people about hunting, you'll find that they will recognize that their own hunters are not following their own laws, which is very problematic from a campaign point of view, because when you go out to the Han people and say, we have indigenous rights, we take care of the local ecology, you can trust us. We don't trust the laws, but if we don't want you to make laws, we want you to trust our laws. The problem is that their laws are not being enforced by the local community. And what generally happens in other places who are at a more advanced level of bringing back indigenous laws is that, yes, this is normal as a part of colonialization, that indigenous communities lose these practices. And then when you move to revitalize these practices, there's this phase, because they've been lost, that people are not following them. And it's only when you start the process, you get permission from the government, you get the legal rights to co-manage or to manage your own territory, that then you can bring the process of revitalization and you can bring the standards of the old laws back. But before you can do that, you have to get to the point where you have that autonomy. And to get that autonomy, you have to prove that you have the capacity to do that. And that's the conundrum that these communities are in, because many people don't follow their laws, but they have to get the trust of the community, of the greater Taiwanese community, to give them the authority to enforce their own laws. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yes, thank you very much. And sorry for not introducing me. My name is Koen Wellens and I'm from the University of Oslo, an anthropologist working on China and Taiwan. But thanks a lot. Yeah, that really answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Koen. So I think we only have time for one last question, which is in the chat box. I'll just read it out to you. It's from Ming Fang. If Jamin, you want to ask your own question, you can turn on your video. Otherwise, I'll just read it out. Okay, so Jamin said, thank you for this interesting presentation. I did field work in a Tibetan village in northwest Sichuan. The Tibetan villagers there have to hand over their hunting guns to the government. But when their fields are destroyed by the Boers, they try to kill some of them. And then the hunters distribute the meat to all the villagers to keep it as a secret. And he or she is wondering whether there are similar coordination or protection in the Daya community for to keep that hunting traditions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, I have to be honest, like the communities that I studied, I didn't feel like they were very much influenced by the official Taiwan law. I mean, there's a lot of illegal things happening in Dayan communities, and I think everybody knows that. So that's exactly the problem, and it's kind of the problem of arbitrary enforcement in Taiwan that kind of terrorizes indigenous people, because indigenous people continue with their practices without regard to the law, but they're always in fear of being caught. There's some adjustments so that, for example, indigenous people hunt at night. And I don't believe that was the case before, but if you hunt at night, it's harder to get caught. There is a similar tradition of sharing the meat, and a major part of Dayan culture is called eating together. And so you can see this down to the economic system. I mean, some communities like Samakusu are officially kind of socialist, based on the model of kibbutz, because they're Christians. They went to Israel and learned about communal living from the kibbutz, and this was very similar to the practices of eating together, which was part of their tradition. And so traditionally in the hunting practice is you always share with the community. You never take the meat for yourself. That's part of the gaga. And it makes sense because that's part of survival. You know, one hunter will maybe get a catch, and you would hope that that can feed the community at the time, and then the next time another hunter will get a catch and share it with everybody too. And so this is also part of the system where, yes, there's a recognition that there's illegal hunting behavior going on, but it's known throughout the community and kind of flouted, and still the traditional practices of sharing are going on.
Okay, does it answer your question, Jingmen? Yes. Okay, excellent. So we are coming to the end of this presentation. So I really, on behalf of Sci-Tech Asia, want to thank Jeffrey for this fantastic research presentation. And I can already see a lot of papers you can derive from this work. So thank you. I hope you also enjoyed the Q&A, and thanks everyone for joining today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Loretta. It was a pleasure to be here today. And thank you to everyone else that was involved in planning at Sci-Tech Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.